Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. In this video, we will discuss about LogicApp parameters and variable. How to use the parameters and variable within the standard LogicApp integration service. Hi, my name is Rakesh Suryavanshi and you're watching PL Learner. For the demonstration, I have created a standard LogicApp. In our previous demonstration, we have discussed how do we create or design your workflow in the consumption-based logic app. In this particular demonstration, we will take a look at the standard logic app. I have created a standard logic app which I've given it a name as the standard dash app. This is my standard logic app where I have a existing workflow created which is currently enabled, and this is a stateful workflow. When we click here on the add buttons, you will get an option to create a workflow, and you can specify whether you would like to create a stateful workflow or the stateless workflow. What is a stateful and a stateless workflow we have already discussed in the previous video, so link is given in the description in case if you are interested to know the difference between these two. For now, in this demonstration, I'll be creating a stateful workflow and I'll give it a name as the workflow. As I have mentioned in my previous videos that the workflow can share the properties or the information from this logic app panel. For example, I could define the different number of connections, parameters, liquid maps, or the app setting configuration, which can be shared across these particular workflows. So for now, in this demonstration, I'll design my workflow. So I'll click on the workflow which we have just now created. As you can see that right now we do not have any workflow design element added to this particular workflow. So I can click here simply on the edit designer. I can click here on the edit locally on the Visual Studio Code. You can also develop the Logic app on the Visual Studio Code as well, which we'll have a look at in our future demonstration. Here you will get in some idea about your workflow, such as the name of the logic app, the status of your workflow, whether it is enabled or disabled, type of workflow, which is a stateful or a stateless workflow. If your logic app is using the HTTP type of trigger, then you would see the workflow URL as well. Currently, we have not defined our workflow design, so you cannot see any run history, but once you define your workflow and you trigger your workflow by clicking here on the trigger button, you will see all your run history related to this particular workflow. Now you can also see the code view in case if you are interested to manage your workflow from the code, or if you would like to edit or manage your workflow from the code section. You can click here on the code section and you can modify the JSON representation of your entire logic app integration workflow. I'm not so expert on the designer or managing the workflow from the code section, so I would prefer to go on the designer. Once you click here on the designer, that will give you a starting point to define your designer. As I mentioned in my previous video that the logic app would require at least one trigger point to start your workflow, and that's the reason it is giving you an option to choose an operation. An operation is nothing, just a trigger type which you would like to choose from for your workflow. Here on the right side, I'm getting the different option to choose my trigger. As you can see at the start, it says add and trigger. It means that a very first thing I need to do is to add a new trigger. Now these are the different options which I can choose to define my trigger. The options in the logic app standard type are defined in two different categories. One is called the built-in and other one is called the Azure. Azure means the managed type of connectors which you can use in your logic app. Now what is the difference between the built-in and managed? I'll create a dedicated video for that, but just for a summary, you understand that the built-in connectors are the connectors managed by Microsoft Azure team, and you do not have to pay anything additional to use those connectors, whereas the Azure connectors are the connector which are being managed by the community, Azure community, and you might require to pay while using those connectors. So it is always important to know which type of connector you would like to use in your logic app, because that might add additional cost on using your logic app in your integration program. So be aware of choosing a specific connector which you would like to use in your integration. With that, I'm going to use any of these connector to start with it. Let's take an example of this particular control connector. Can I use this particular control connector? So when I'm going to click here on the control connector, I'll see another further two different tabs, trigger and action. At the moment, there are some connector which do not provide the ability to set up a trigger. For example, this particular control connector which I have selected, with that control connector, there are no triggers available because by design or by behavior of this particular connector, it doesn't provide a option to specify the trigger. That's why I cannot use the control connector as in my start or the entry point or starting point. So I'll have to go to the back option. So I'll click here on the go back option and I cannot use the connector type. Now let's look at some of the other connector type. For example, the data operation type. If I use the data operation type, can I use the trigger? No, I cannot use the trigger. Can I use the actions? Yes, there are different types of actions available within this particular connector which you can use. But unfortunately, as we are on the very first step, I cannot use this action because the very first step, remember I mentioned you need to have a connector in place. So even though if I try to use this particular action, it will say, no, you cannot use this action as a trigger. Please select a trigger type to start with it. So let's go back to the basics and let's see what other options I have. So the other option I have is a time-based trigger or the HTTP trigger, HTTP request trigger, which I can choose to start with it, or I can choose a servicebus or SFTP trigger to start with it. I'll go for the time-based trigger, which is the simplest trigger to demonstrate right now, not to make too complicated. So I'll select a time, date time. Here again, I'm getting the actions, different actions, add to time, convert to time zone, current time zone, and so on. And then I'll select trigger. No, I do not have any triggers on the time, date time as well, which means that this date time option again I cannot use. So let's use the other date time type of connector, which is a schedule connector. Now if I go to and select a schedule connector, fortunately I'm getting a trigger option, which is a recurrent schedule trigger. So if I select this recurrent schedule trigger, it asks me to specify the configuration values such as the interval, on what time interval this particular recurrence trigger should be recurrencing to start my workflow. And then there is a frequency option which is available, which I should be using. So on what frequency this should trigger, let's say every 15 minutes. Then again, it has certain number of other options which we have already seen or discussed in our previous demonstration. So I'll not go and discuss the same thing again. Next, you have a settings tab. So you can specify the settings for each and individual connector. So for example, this recurrence trigger, I can specify the concurrency control for my trigger type, whether this trigger should run on multi-concurrency mode or a single concurrency mode. So that is what I can specify. So by default, it is enabled to set on a given concurrency mode. But if I would like to run on, by default, it is set up to run on a multiple concurrency mode, which is of by default value as in 25. But if I would like to change this value from 25 to let's say 100, then I can set. Or if I do not want this to run on multi-thread or multi concurrency mode, then I can set this as a degree of parallelism to 1, which means only one trigger at a time will run on a given workflow. Unless that is not going to be finished, the next one will not start. That's what it means. Okay, now I'll cancel this. Next, you have a code option. So whatever trigger point which you have, you can see here as a designer. For the same designer, you can see the code as well, in case if you would like to copy and use this particular code block in your code option manually, then you can you choose this particular code option as well. Then there are some information about the different type of connectors or the connector which you are currently, which you have currently selected. So it is giving you some information about that particular connector as well. I can simply save this connector and my workflow is at least ready, because my trigger is there. So I have a trigger at least to start with it for my workflow. Now next option is, again, there are a number of built-in options available. I can go and select or define my variables. So let's say initialize variable, and here I'll say has errors in case if I would like to manage, and default value I'll say no, it doesn't have any value error. Similarly, I can add a new action in between these two by clicking on this particular plus button. So if I click here on the plus button, it will add a new action in between these two steps. Let's say I'll say another variable, which I'll say run ID, and I'll keep string. And let's say I would like to add a next step in between these two. I'll click on this. In between these two, I'll click on here. And now if I would like to add a next step to the after a very last connector, then I can click here on this particular button. Now what if I would like to add a next step parallel to this particular step or parallel to this particular step? Then what you can do is you can click here on the add action button, and you can choose an option, add an action, which will add an action just below to this the parent. Or if you click add a parallel branch, then it will add the action which just below to the parent, but it will add in parallel to the child action, like this. So let's add a new variable section. I'll say test, and this time I'll say integer value, and I'll say 10. Okay, so this is how I've defined the variable. Now you can also say change the value of this variable, which was not possible in case of using the consumption based logic app. Similarly, I can change the value as has, where has error, like this, so that I know what is the name of these. So where run ID, something like that. Save it. Now my workflow is ready to start and run. So I can click here on the overview section. Hopefully it might have already triggered when I saved for the very first time. As you can see that when I've saved the workflow trigger very first time, it has already been triggered. But obviously it did not had the other options like variables, steps, which we have added. So to see those options, I would simply click here and run this. So this will give you some idea how do we use the variables within the workflow. So if I click the history of the workflow trigger, click here, you will see run history of the workflow. Sorry about that. Yeah. So we have got our variable, which we have set the value to nothing. Then it has got a has value variable, which has a value as false. And then we have a variable test, which has an integer type of value, and default value we have given as a 10. Now this is about the variable. Now what about the parameters? So if you look at the designer, and you have the option as in parameters, right? So now I can specify the parameters by clicking here on the create new parameter, or the parameter is not been added. Then I can click here and add a new parameter. So let's say I will call it as a param string. Okay, and I'll specify the type of the parameter, which can be array, boolean, float, integer, object, or a string. So in this case, as it is a string type of variable, so I'll say string parameter. Okay, next I can add another parameters, which will, let's say param number, and here I'm going to say integer, and the value is going to be 1 million, for example. Okay, so the parameters are being added. I can click here on the close button. That's it. Now, if I would like to use these parameters, for example, run ID, at the moment run ID is not been set to any value. So what I can do is I can click here on the value. As soon as I click here, the dynamic content box gives me two options now, which is first option is the parameter. Both the option are my parameter, basically the parameter number and parameter string which I have created. So I can simply click here and choose my parameter as the value of my variable which I would like to use. Similarly, I can create another step here. Let's say this time I'm going to use the data operation step. I'll choose a compose data operation and I can say what is the value I would like to specify. I can specify as let's say a JSON value. So I can say ID equals to, and then I can use specify the parameter number. So this is going to be my ID to within my JSON, right? Now, as soon as I save this, and if I run the workflow again, I should be able to use those parameters which I have used, which I have specified there. I'll refresh it. Now this has been successfully triggered. Nothing too fancy. We have just specified the variable. Now if I go and check the variable values, you can see that I'm getting the value from my parameter, string parameter, which was the value of my string type of parameter. Similarly, in the compose, I'm constructing a JSON, and the ID, the value of the ID I'm getting is the number value of my parameters, right? So this is how you can use the parameters and variable combined together in your workflow. Now, the interesting thing about the parameters which we have specified, you can find those parameters in case if you would like to modify straight away without going into a workflow. You can click here on the parameters section and you will find all your parameters which you have defined in any of your workflows like this, right? Now, what I can do here is I can go to my second workflow, which is not being, which from where we have not declared any workflow, we have not declared any parameters. So if I simply go to that particular workflow, let's say workflow designer, which is right now there is no designer created. So I'll simply again create a recurrence type of workflow, schedule recurrence. I'll choose the default value as is. Now if you look at the, if I click here on this particular parameter section, I'll see all those two parameters. Like I mentioned, all the parameters, connections, and app settings, everything is shared across the different workflow within the logic app configuration. That's why I can see that particular parameter value, and I can use those parameters straight away as I wish to use it. For example, if I again simply use the compose option, I'll create a compose option from here. I'll create a JSON as an ID, and then value is going to be number ID, comma, next value I'll say param, and then again I will use this string, and again I will create a name as, let's say, Rakesh, double quotes. That's it. So this is going to be my JSON. Now remember, in this case we are giving it, we are sharing a demonstration wherein we are using the parameters, a single parameter on two different type of workflows, right? So now if I run this, or if it is already been run now, if you just open that, you will see that particular step having the compose option, and then compose is generating the ID, which is coming from parameter, name, which I have hard coded the value as Rakesh, and the param, which is my third attribute within the JSON, which is again coming from the parameter. So this is how I can construct a JSON with the help of different parameters or the variables. And this was the quick demonstration how to use the parameter and JSON. I hope you have found this useful and you would be able to use these values in your logic app workflow. Now, last thing I would like to show you before I call off this particular demonstration, which is how do you read the value of this last thing I would like to show in this particular demonstration about the parameters At the moment, as you can see that the parameter values are being hard coded here on this particular section. But what if you would like to read parameter values from the app settings? For example, let's say I'll say that my servicebus topic name. Okay, now these values I would like to, let's say, read it from the configuration, which is the app settings. So what I can do in this case, I can use this at app settings tag, which is in the double quotes, and this app settings, let me save this, and this app settings I can specify here in the configuration. So let's say when you provision the logic app infrastructure, you can define this configuration block as an app setting configuration. Topic name is going to be customer order topic. Okay, that's it. Save this. So this is a customer order topic name, let's say coming from the infrastructure when it is being provisioned, saying that my logic app would require to connect to this particular service bus topic. Now if I go to the workflow, let it save this. If I go to the workflow, let's go to our first workflow, which is this one. I'll go to the designer, and now if I simply use the same workflow rather than same step rather than modifying, and I'll say topic name double quotes, and I can see that this variable is available, which I can use it. Let's use this variable, save it, and we'll run again and see whether it is able to read the value of this variable from the app settings. So just to remind you, or just to show you again, this time the value of this variable, we are reading it from the app settings. So rather than hard coding the value of those variables like this, I'm reading the values from the app settings. So let me see that. If I run again, while it is running, we can see the history as well. Now if I go to the compose, you can see that the value customer order topic, which is being read from the app setting. So in a summary, we have seen how do you define the variables on your workflow, how do you set the value of those variables, how do you define the parameters in your workflow, and how do you share the value of those parameters across the different workflow. And at last, we have seen how do you read the value of the parameter from the app settings of your standard logic app. I hope you have found this useful. If it is, please give it a thumbs up and do not forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you have any questions, please do let me know in the comment section. Thanks for watching it. See you in the next video.